I'd like to call to order the work session on, 3rd of June. It is now 5 o'clock. So we're calling this work session to order. We are all present, so welcome. So let's get right on to the agenda items. We have 2 items on the agenda tonight. I would remind council that staff will be pausing intermittently to answer any questions. So the first item is 3.1, and it's a presentation regarding the Americans with Disability Act and transportation options. And Christina, our favorite person, right, McMurdy? No, sorry, I wouldn't get it to her. Yes. We don't,
Too late.
we don't
Too
see
late.
her very often, so, have
I
to
got
look,
it.
make sure that's who it is.
Better not screw up.
Administrative Services Supervisor will present. Christina,
Actually, I am going to toss it over to your other favorite person, Rebecca Zook.
would you just pull that closer? We're getting a real
Yeah,
echo
I
up
can
here.
hear feedback. Okay, I am going to toss it over to Rebecca to introduce our guest, who, by the way, is getting over a cold. So he's going to appreciate everybody talking into the mic just like you ask them to.
Good.
All right. Well, thank you, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and council members. We're very happy to be here this evening to talk about Goodyear's Paratransit service, and then also open up a discussion about current and future needs with you. I'm joined tonight, as you said, by our Administrative Services Supervisor, Christine McMurdy. Christine has been coordinating Goodyear's transit services since 2003. Christine is the city's representative on numerous MAG committees, the Transit Committee, the Urbanized Area Working Group, Valley Metro Regional Technical Advisory Committee, and the Financial Working Group, as well as Valley Metro's Accessible Transit Services Committee. She also manages the operations at the Goodyear Park and Ride. In addition, we have a very special guest with us, Ron Brooks, from Valley Metro. He is the manager of Accessible Transit Services since May of 2014. He's responsible for managing paratransit, ride choice, the Regional Paratransit Eligibility Certification Program, travel and training, and the Regional Reduced Fare ID Card Program. He has held various positions over the past 21 years to include the Bay Area Rapid Transit District in Oakland, California, and Palm Tran in Palm Beach, Florida. We're happy to have him guide us through this evening's presentation. First, I'll just give you the presentation objectives for tonight. We're going to go ahead and we have a lot of information to cover. We would like to present the paratransit requirements in general with the federal guidelines, as well as we want to talk about Goodyear's ADA paratransit service coverage. At that point, we're going to go ahead and pause for questions because that's a good stopping point, because we're talking about what does paratransit mean, and then also what are we doing today in Goodyear. And then we'll go ahead so what I'll call part 2 is we're going to talk about options for serving the portions of Goodyear beyond what we do today. After we provide that information, we'll open it up for questions. And we're interested in having a robust conversation about opportunities for Goodyear. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Mayor, council members. First off, I just want to, I'm not sure whether I should thank Rebecca or chide her. She took 6 months of my seniority away, which matters, for my ASRS vesting. I actually joined Valley Metro in October of 2013, but she also did me a service because my career is actually 25 years, and she only hit me for 21, so I'm actually pretty happy about that. So, thank you for having me. I want to just start and just talk. It's just difficult because I'm talking about a complicated subject, which is at 5 o'clock in the evening. So I will definitely encourage you to ask me questions or raise comments as we go. And of course, we've got stopping points. So let me just start and talk about ADA as a civil right. And this is really important because, did it not advance?
That's right.
Okay. So this is really important because a lot of people don't realize that ADA is actually a civil right. It is not an entitlement. And that word sounds like a value judgment. I don't mean it to. But as a civil right, what ADA actually does is it is intended to create equity and equality for people with disabilities. It is not a law that creates new new mandates or programs that give people new things that they weren't supposed to have all along. It's designed to create equal access. So what the law does is it mandates equal access to the same programs and services that others receive. Access should be in the most integrated setting possible. And that's important too. And when we start to talk about the transit, the goal of the ADA was never and is not to give people a completely separate transportation system. The separate transportation system was created so that people with disabilities who couldn't use the integrated system could use it. You're going to do it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So they don't trust me with the technology, and that's a good thing. So let's talk about specifically about the intent of the ADA for public transit. First off, the goal of the ADA and the goal for not only for Valley Metro but for all public transit operators is that our transit system, bus and light rail service, be accessible to the extent absolutely possible. So the law has very specific requirements that we as a public transit agency are supposed to meet, and other transit agencies across the country. That vehicles are accessible, that stations and stops are accessible, that people can get on the buses and the trains, that announcements are out loud and also visual so that people can hear and see them, that there are places for people with disabilities and seniors to sit near the front of the vehicles. Those are requirements of the law because, again, the intent is that people use the accessible public transit system if at all possible. Then, paratransit is available and required for people who cannot use public transit because of a disability. Because there are lots of folks who have disabilities who may not be able to use transit. Maybe they can't get to the nearest transit stop or station. Maybe there's not an accessible path. Maybe there's maybe their disability is such that they can't be out in our hot weather. There are other people that have sensitivity to cold and wet. So what the law basically says is there are people who cannot use public transit, even when it's accessible. Paratransit is a system that is required to provide them with equal access to the benefit of public transportation. Now, eligibility, the process, that is a locally established process by law. Every transit agency has to establish the procedures for becoming eligible. We did that in this region. The process that's in place for this region is for the entire metropolitan area, Maricopa County, is an in-person assessment process that customers come who believe they have disabilities that prevent them from using public transit, some or all of the time, can call us. We bring them to Valley Metro, to one of our locations in Phoenix, and we take them through a simulated trip on public transit. So we, first off, we ask them a few questions to assess their cognitive ability. We also want to find out how are they traveling now. If they're using public transit, that's obviously telling us something. We want to find out, where are they going? How are they getting there? What challenges do they have when they're traveling? So that we can determine, are they a good candidate for paratransit? If a customer appears to be able, we will then take them out on a literal walk or roll if they're in a wheelchair through a transit environment that's inside our building, where we have curb cuts and steps and uneven surfaces and cobblestones and street crossings. Everything you would see in a typical environment, we have it inside, including a bus that we have placed in the building when it was built. And we allow people to board that bus so they can see what it involves to ride transit. And we do it in a controlled environment so that we have control over safety. We're not affected by weather or heat. We can actually take a look, and if there's anything that's not safe, we can stop that assessment without creating any risk for the passenger. If they do a good job on the inside assessment, we do go outside and we take a quick, what we call a transit walk down to the 44th Street Light Rail Station, which is near our office. That gives us a chance to see how they do in a real environment with sidewalks and pedestrians and traffic and noise and heat and everything that goes on, because that's all part of the transit experience. We use all that experience, all that knowledge that we gain through that assessment to help them understand what their limitations are and to help us understand what their eligibility should be. The law requires that process. We've had it in place for about 9 years at the Mobility Center, and that's a regional process. So just real quick, any questions so far?
Let me check. Any questions? Sherry?
I have a question. The slide, it says available within 3/4 mile of transit routes.
I went a little too fast. We're still here.
So we're not there yet. Okay.
Yeah, we're going to get there.
She got ahead of me, sorry.
I did.
Okay, I was wondering that because we have areas that aren't, so I'll hold that
We're going to
question
get
then.
there.
Yeah, we're going to get there. That's the next slide.
Molly?
I have a question. If someone has not called and made an appointment and come down to your facility, are they not allowed to use paratransit?
They have to apply to use the service. Now, so, and we try really hard to make that information available. We do a lot of public meetings and presentations. We've got 4 community meetings just this week around the region to talk about this kind of service. But yeah, this is something they have to apply for. And that's in
So my
keeping with
husband's
federal law.
handicapped, so I need to make an appointment with you, bring him down in his mobility scooter for you to tell me that he can ride paratransit.
Right, and actually
Already certified with the doctor and the
Yes.
hospital and everything else.
Yes, and the reason for that is because, first off, the law requires us to establish a process. This region, and this is a decision that was made long before, a lot of us were probably doing what we're doing today, made the decision because in order to create a sense of equity, the law does say that the process has to be fair and equitable, and it also has to be free. So what we actually do is we provide the transportation. So if a customer wants to apply for service, and it's not, the goal here is not whether or not a person has a disability. There are lots of people with disabilities who can use public transit. I use public transit, so others, and including people in mobility devices, use public transit. What the law requires us to do is to assess whether or not a person's disability prevents them from using public transit. That it's not as simple as having a disability. If a customer applies for the service, we bring them at our cost. So it's not something that they have to do separately. About 2/3 of our customers request transportation. About 1/3 get there on their own, either because they have a family member who wants to come with them, or maybe they live close by or whatever. But most of them do accept our transportation.
Okay, I'm going to save my rest of the comments at the end because we will have a big job on our hands to tell all of Pebble Creek before they can ride paratransit. They got to go down there.
Well, I think what he's saying though, Wally, and we will certainly put those questions out, but there are rules.
Yeah, no, I know.
And whether
but
we
I'm
live at
saying
Pebble
we didn't know
Creek
it.
or any place, we all have to follow. And I can actually see the rules, just as his short explanation of it. There is not a privileged class here. So by the process they have, that means that everybody has on equal sides. And so I like that. Because I've seen that too many times through places that we've lived when people need something. There are people that get to go to the first of the line that should be standing in line with the rest of us. So, good job. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So just to talk, excuse me, about the ADA paratransit requirements. So these are the requirements. These are, again, established in law that we as a public transit agency are required to follow. First off, paratransit by law must be provided in areas that are within 3/4 of a mile of a transit route or in our case, light rail station. Now, to be clear, we can go beyond those requirements, but that's not considered ADA mandated paratransit. The law very specifically defines what is ADA paratransit. And the reason for that is because you're not allowed to deny, and I'll get down here on the slide, you can't deny it. So the law basically said this is what, and historically, there were agencies that would provide more, and then they would say, we can't afford it, and so they would try to limit it. And what the law basically said is, here's the deal. 3/4 of a mile either side of a fixed route public transit, fixed public route, or around a subway station or rail station, that's your obligation. You want to do more than that, that's great, but you have to do this. Service has to be available during times when transit is also operating. Service is available on a next day basis, so that is a little different. I mean, you can walk out and catch a bus anytime there's one running, but because paratransit has to be scheduled, the law does require that that we are able to provide a trip on at least a next day basis. Service is pre-scheduled and shared ride. So, and if you're familiar with the dial ride service that's been in place, and what we operate, it is shared ride service. It's a van, typically, sometimes not, but often it's a van. They pick you up. There might be another person on board. There might be somebody that gets picked up and dropped off along the way. And that really is all about efficiency. But it's also about comparability, because if you board a bus or a train, that's also a shared ride. Because if it's not, then they cut the route. So that is, again, it's intended to be comparable. No trip purposes, denials, or priorities or limitations. Just like a bus, you can take it anywhere you want. Nobody asks you where you're going, why you're going, how long you plan to stay. So people can take trips to anywhere. We can't tell them that we don't agree with the trip purpose. We can't limit the number of trips that they take, and we can't deny if a trip is valid based on where it is and when it is, we have to provide it with no limits. Another slight difference, the fare for paratransit is no more than twice the fare for a comparable trip on public transit. That was the case again. Paratransit costs quite a bit more. That was a compromise written into the law, so it can be twice as much. So here in this region, a transit fare on the bus, $2. A dial ride or paratransit fare is $4. So I'll just go ahead and show you a couple of maps, and then I think we have a kind of a built-in stop. This first map here, this is the regional paratransit system. You can see the service area, all the jurisdictions, then the paratransit is service area is overlaid. We've marked, obviously, we've marked Goodyear here on as well. So you can see it's a very large area. We go all the way from Mesa to Goodyear, and all the way from North Scottsdale down to pretty far south in Chandler. So I mean, it's a very, very large area that we're serving out all the way to Peoria and Sun City and almost to Surprise. So huge area. The next map here, this focuses in on Goodyear, and this really points to the reality here, which is that you have some ADA paratransit service area, but you have large parts of the community that fall outside the 3/4 mile boundary around the service area. So those areas currently do not have service at this time. Just to talk about how service is provided, this slide talks about what's going to happen on July 1. I'm sorry?
I got it.
Okay. This slide talks about what's going to happen on July 1st. Currently, the City of Phoenix provides service, Southwest Valley Dial Ride. It's provided by Phoenix through its Dial Ride contract. On July 1st, the service is transitioning to Valley Metro Paratransit, so it's by us and our provider. We are very pleased to be your provider, but it actually wasn't our idea. Phoenix came to us and asked us to do that because we were providing everybody's regional service already, and from their standpoint, it made sense and simplicity to have Valley Metro serve all of the trips outside of the City of Phoenix, and particularly trips, and this for your customers, it means one phone number instead of two. Right now, they have to make a decision about who to call. After July 1st, Valley Metro is the provider for all the trips. There are no service policy changes right now. Service is still available within 3/4 of a mile of a transit route. Call center hours, now those are changing, but they're actually changing to match Phoenix, which is also changing 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. to request trips. The phones are actually open during all service hours for customers who have service, but if they want to request a trip, for tomorrow, they need to call by 7 p.m. tonight. Service is available Monday through Saturday from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. That's actually, I think, a slight increase because it matches regional service hours. I think it's like a half an hour more. And then on Sundays, 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. So those are the hours that people can travel. Fare, $4 for a one-way trip. With one exception, there is a small area around the Zoom routes in Avondale, and I think that touches the edge of Goodyear. If you are in that area within a quarter mile on either side of that route, the Zoom fare kicks in, because remember, it's twice the fare. The Zoom has a lower fare. It's a 50-cent fare, so those trips cost $1. We had exactly none of those trips last year, just because it's a pretty small area. So I will stop here. This is the point where we wanted to just answer any questions about paratransit as it's operated here, or about how the ADA requires us to operate it.
Thank you. Sherry?
I guess that's where my 3/4 of a mile is, because looking at those maps, most of our community is not covered at all. I mean, I'd say 95% of our community isn't covered by a really good program. So I guess rather than this program, we're going to have to look at a supplemental program to help our citizens in the other areas.
You're jumping ahead.
Yeah, we're going to talk about
We're
that.
gonna
I
talk
saw that.
about
No, I
it.
looked ahead earlier
coming in.
last night, but I was just wondering because it doesn't look like we can really participate in this program. Although it's a really great program, like up in Astray or even parts of, Pebble Creek, I don't even think fit into that area.
So let me, if I could jump in very quickly, and we are going to cover some options that we here in Goodyear can consider, but as it falls under the paratransit service, that is correct. This is the boundary because this is where we have existing bus service and Zoom service, and so that's where the federally mandated 3/4 of a mile. So beyond that, it's called something different, but we can still consider offering services.
So it's basically our lack of public transit is why it doesn't, because we don't have the public transit, we can't build on the other programs.
Correct.
Wally?
Okay, so you don't have to answer this right now if you're going to tell me you're going to answer it later. But do you have the perimeters of which right now you can tell me it comes down Camelback to Litchfield to this to that for Goodyear only? Are y'all prepared to do that? And also, how many calls have come to Goodyear in the last year? How many actual dial-a-ride or paratransit or whatever you're calling it has actually been initiated by our residents in the small zone area that you do service?
Okay, thank you, Vice Mayor. I can't, essentially, it's where the blue overlaps the pink.
Yeah, I know, but it doesn't.
But I'll give you, I can give you the specific details, not right now because it's really 3/4. It doesn't fall exactly on particular roadways.
Okay.
But what we can do is we can fill this in and give some street names and things like that. So we can give it to you, follow up on that if that's okay.
Okay.
And then your other question about number of calls, I think we can get that information. I'm not sure we have it, but the next slide, we're actually going to talk about what we're proposing,
Okay,
just following this same paratransit, what we anticipate FY20, and essentially that's based off of what we saw in FY19 and prior years. So that could give you a flavor of how many people are utilizing it.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Great.
Oh, and one more question.
Yes.
So how would the reduced fares work? Because I don't know who's eligible for reduced fares,
Okay.
but they do not pay the $2, nor do they pay the 50 cents, I don't think.
So reduced fares for bus and light rail are actually they're based on a federal requirement that predates the ADA.
Right.
In 1973, the Federal Rehab Act required transit agencies at that time who were federal funds recipients to offer reduced fares to seniors and other people who are not able to benefit from public transit. And that's where those come from. The ADA explicitly by law ties that paratransit fare to the regular non-discounted adult transit fare. So they're pretty much unrelated. Now, one of the things we do in this region that's not required by law, if a person is ADA paratransit certified, we provide them, if they wish, with a free transit pass that's good for all bus and light rail service. And the reason we do that is because there are some people with disabilities who, even though they're eligible for paratransit, they might be able to take transit sometimes, and we want to encourage them to do that. So we try to make that as easy as we can. We also offer free travel training where a professional person who's an instructor, who knows how to teach people to use public transit will come and meet them at their home or wherever they want to take a trip and take them on the trip that they want to take and teach them how to use the transit system. So we give them the training and we give them the pass if they're able to do that.
I'm not really sure that's apropos for Goodyear because we really don't have a transit. We have no light rail and we have very limited bus
Right.
service.
Right.
And if you're disabled, I don't think you're going to want to catch the 6 a.m. bus to go downtown Phoenix and wait all day to come back late in the afternoon.
Right.
So
I mean, obviously, it's the service. I mean, training and free passes are only as good as the availability of the service. But
Yeah.
but we do actually have customers who use the Platinum Pass, is what we call it, from Goodyear. They come downtown. We do have some folks with disabilities who are a little younger who have jobs, who are going to training programs where they are able to take
Wonderful.
advantage of the services. They're not. Obviously, a lot of people can't, but some people can. And we make those available across the region for people who can.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Joe?
I think Wally touched on part of it, but I was trying to get a flavor for what is required, what that demand, those costs are to us currently right now, and how many people are using it. So I'd be curious to see what that level of demand is right now and what we're paying for that service.
Absolutely, and that'll be the next slide.
Yep. So we can jump into that if you'd like.
Yep.
So these are projections for FY20.
Oh, we have one more question.
Oh, sorry.
Brandon?
So this might be a future slide. So who mandates the route? Is it Valley Metro that says it stops there in Goodyear? Or is that something we have to pay to extend it anywhere we want in the city? Who actually creates new routes? If that was even an option we want to do in the future, or
So
that
if we
process?
establish a route, for instance, when we started the Zoom extension, as soon as we made that commitment, we created an ADA 3/4 mile requirement.
Okay,
If you extend any bus route, you are mandated by the Federal Transit Administration to provide that 3/4 mile boundary around your transit service.
okay. And that's locked in once you set it up, right?
That is it.
So even if we did a pilot or something like that, would that still lock in that 3/4, or would that only be for? I'm probably jumping ahead, but
We're going to actually talk a little bit about circulators, and there are some caveats. So if you just hold that thought, we're going to get to it in about 2 or 3 slides.
Well, and
Okay.
if I could, I just want to jump in, council member, and make sure I understand your question, because what I thought I heard, and just correct me if I'm wrong, is, are you asking how could we potentially, Route 1, let's say that's the red route, how could we extend Route 1 to potentially extend over to Cotton and then head down Cotton up to Estrella? So in other words, how could we extend a bus route?
yeah, exactly.
So I'm going to actually hand that over to Christine to explain, but it's based on working with Valley Metro and performance measures and things of that and usage, because there is a federal funding associated with that, and we need to provide that there would be enough usage of that facility. So Christine?
So between this evening and then next Monday, you're going to start seeing a little more information about our available revenue sources for transit, and they're somewhat limited. Other cities have more transit because they do have a revenue source that's dedicated. But they can't just go out and decide that just because they put a shopping center in at a certain location, you can create a bus route. There are certain planning performance requirements that have to be met in order to be able to get that approval, begin that service. There has to be fleet available, there has to be a contractor available, and then you have to make sure that there are certain activity centers in that area that are going to fill a bus from the beginning of the day through the end of the day, which is why our service area is fairly limited. We would never ask the council to commit to expanding service unless we, with our partners at Valley Metro, realize that there are certain activity centers that are going to generate ridership. So that's some of what, we're going to talk a little bit more about that tonight. So you'll see what we're looking forward to, because so much has changed since the last time we brought transit to you to discuss at least this much. So we're going to look at that more.
Okay, thank you.
Laura?
The three-quarter range obviously is very small. How can we assess where our underserved customers may be? How do you identify where the community is that need these services?
This is a toughie. Over the time that I've been doing this, and it's over 10 years now, I've been amazed at how few people actually reach out and ask. I really don't get that many phone calls. I imagine Christina Penetescu, our community services coordinator, she may be getting them. I know she knows the answer just as well as I do. We usually ask where people need to go and try to find alternatives for them. But it's tough because we really can't extend a service area unless we're assured that we can fill a bus.
Any other questions before we go on? All right, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, so just to give you a perspective on kind of current, these are projections for paratransit. So these are basically trips that are being taken within that three-quarter mile service area. I don't have unduplicated numbers of passengers. Speak in terms of trips, about 1,800 one-way trips is what we're projecting. The cost for that service is about $96,800 and change. And we do have some funding coming from passenger fares, about $14,400 from from public transit funds, Prop 400. And so the rest is quite honestly coming from you, and I think you all have some revenue sources for that. The cost of this service, and this is why it's important to try to have a fairly rigorous eligibility process. It's why we spend effort to train people who want to get trained to use our public transit, and it's why we give free passes to people who do, because after all of those revenues go in, it's $41 a trip. So it's an expensive service. It's a mandated service, so I mean we certainly that number is actually, it's not unusual for this type of service because of the requirements of the service, the vehicles, the drivers, the requirements they have to meet, the training, the technology that drives it. Those things obviously make the service expensive. So our job is to be pretty judicious with how it gets provided. So any questions about that?
Any other? No, go ahead.
Okay. All right. So this is where we start to talk about options for that area of Goodyear that does not currently have service. And there's really a couple of options that we'd like to talk to you about. One of them is our Valley Metro Ride Choice program, which we'll come to in a few minutes. And the other one is community circulator service, which is basically, we're going to define what that looks like and talk about that some. So talking about a circulator, and there's a lot. The thing about circulators to keep in mind is there are as many types of circulators as there are circulators. Even in this valley, we have 2 or 3 different circulators operated by different communities. Valley Metro operates those under contract along with our bus services, and they operate differently even from each other. But there are some basics, and so basically the purpose of a circulator is to connect neighborhoods. The idea is to connect maybe to a transit stop, to a high capacity transit like a park and ride, maybe to some activity centers, employment, education, medical. It's basically the idea is to basically take a route in a small area, get people picked up at their homes, get them to the things within their local area that they need, or to the transit system so that they can take advantage of the rest of the service. It is typically scheduled, but it can also be flexible service. So you can have a circulator, for example, that runs every half hour in a neighborhood, or every hour in a neighborhood. But you can also make the circulator a little bit more flexible where it can divert to pick people up if they call and request. Typically, it's run with vans or minibuses so that people can, so there's some flexibility. It is, and the thing with services like these, if you design it in such a way that it's not, it has an ADA obligation. And when we talk about the Zoom services, those are scheduled circulators. They run on a route. They don't deviate off of those routes. Those services require an ADA paratransit obligation because they basically operate like fixed route public transit bus service. If you operate a circulator that diverts, you can avoid some ADA obligation, but then you give up productivity because the vehicle's travel times get longer. So the type of circulator that you operate is very specific to the neighborhood that you're trying to serve and the ridership that you're trying to serve. So just looking at the existing circulators here, kind of some of them here in the region, just to look at the Zoom, I've got the south and the north here listed. You can see some of the statistics. The thing that I want to call to your attention about these services is there's a fairly tall hill to climb to get them started. And that's because you're buying equipment. There's some, there's the vehicles, because it usually takes a few to run the service. There's the driver, there's the technology. So there's startup costs for the service, and then there's ongoing operating cost. The Zoom South, of course, is the bigger route, so it has higher costs. But both of these are, pretty significant multi-million-dollar investments that over time, hopefully through ridership, they get the productivity that they need to do what they're supposed to do, which is to basically bring people into the region so that they can get connected to the rest of the transit system. On the next slide, I've got here Pogo. This is a brand new Peoria on the go. This is a circulator. Again, it runs like a fixed route transit service. It's running on a loop, basically connecting activity centers in Peoria to the Lake Pleasant area. So it's a fairly long route. And again, this was a fairly costly service to get started. But again, I mean, this is an area that it would cost more to serve with a fixed route large bus. So it works better operationally and financially to serve it with a circulator. Yep.
If I could jump in here real quick and just talk a little bit about the funding for both. So for the Zoom, it is 50%, is that correct? 50% federally funded. And so is that, Christine, can you explain a little bit about that? Because that was both with the startup and the operating side.
So in the 2000 census, the federal government recognized that the Avondale Goodyear area geographically had grown outside of the Phoenix Mesa Glendale area. There is that, you could almost look at the Loop 101 freeway as a dividing line because there was an enormous amount of growth and urbanization occurring to the east of us. But while we were growing a little bit slower, we were still growing by master plan communities. Mayor remembers, most of you remember that, this city grew by master plan communities at a time. And that rapid growth rate was recognized by the Census Bureau. So it basically provided a designation for Avondale, Goodyear, pieces of Tolleson, pieces of Surprise, pieces of Glendale to receive a specific federal funding source that allows us to receive 50% operating assistance to whatever it costs for us to operate the circulator. And then we also get 80% federal assistance for capital expenses, buses, facilities, studies, planning studies. The only caveat with this funding source is while it's great to have it, you only get it for 10 years. And when you put something out, when you put transit service out, it's very difficult to pull it back. So making a commitment beyond 10 years is a very challenging thing to do if you don't have the ability to come back in and provide an alternative funding source. So we have been very conservative over the last 10 years using those funds, making sure that whatever we did with Zoom was, according to a study we did in 2013, just a test. We're just checking to see if people would warm up to a circulator, would use a circulator to get around our communities. And to be perfectly honest with you, there were people in Avondale that really wanted to get to some of our shopping in Goodyear. So there was actually not so much a push, but Avondale was advocating for Goodyear to kind of jump in. So we've made that commitment. It will expire in 2022. We'll lose the operating assistance, but we'll keep the capital because this smaller UZA, the smaller urbanized area, is continuing to grow. We're growing at a different rate from the Glendale Mesa, Phoenix area, but we're still within the control of how we're spending our money. We have the match that we provide for the Zoom service is our Arizona Lottery funds, our ALF funds. And then in addition to that, we have the digital marquee at the Park and Ride. That was a one-time $500,000 gift. It was a one-time allocation, and then we get advertising revenue from the marquee year over year. That allocation now or that balance is now up to about 1.1 million. And then we also, for Dial Ride, and Ron mentioned this earlier, we receive Prop 400 funds. We get the half-cent sales tax. That's a fixed amount. We get $14,400 every year. That's not going to be enough to cover us, so the lottery funds have really come in handy. Our Arizona Lottery Fund allocation is going to be around $200,000 to about $230,000 for the next couple of years. It grows as our population grows. So we're monitoring all these funding sources, and we're also, and I was even talking to Ron earlier, I've just learned tonight there may be another federal funding source that we can look at for some of the ride choice that we're going to talk about soon that we might be able to use to get some assistance. So everything we're doing right now is just trying to get us to the point where you have the opportunity to consider some other options. Nothing we've done so far is anything that we can't pull back. The 3 buses that touch our area, the express bus, which is at the Park and Ride, that's 4 trips every day. Route 17, which runs along McDowell Road from Dysart to Pebble Creek Parkway, that's the Goodyear part that we are responsible for. And then Route 3, which runs on Van Buren but stops at Central. It really doesn't cross over into our city, but there's a few miles there where the bus has to turn around that we're responsible for. Those 3 routes are covered by Prop 400. There is no Goodyear local assistance necessary for those to continue to operate. As you know, Mayor, we're beginning those conversations now about what Prop 400 extension is going to look like. The timeliness of this conversation is perfect for that. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more toward the end of our presentation, but thank you, Rebecca. That kind of gives you an idea of why Zoom is different from POGO. We do get some federal funding assistance, and we're using it, but we're using it very conservatively.
Well, and then from POGO, again, they don't have federal assistance, but in 2005, Peoria added a 0.3 cent sales tax increase dedicated to funding transportation projects and to serve Peoria. And so that's what is at least partially funding their POGO.
Okay.
So I've got a question.
Oh, excuse me, Molly, go ahead.
So did we pay startup funds to start the Zoom, and do we own those buses?
No, we don't own the buses. They're provided by the contractor.
But the money the federal government gave us, we gave the contractor or whoever owns the
We,
buses.
Valley Metro owns the contract for the
Okay.
services. So we pay Valley Metro to provide the service. They pay the contractor.
All right. So with the new census coming up in 2020, is there a possibility that because we have grown so quickly, there may be another funding source that is what I have been told, because I sit on the National League Transportation Committee, and I have been on that for 7 years. But there is additional funding available that we really need to look at. But there'll be more funding available once the census is complete. So I've been told.
We coordinate all of the census activities, especially related to transit, through Maricopa Association of Governments. We have a separate committee that we do that. They're kind of our, like you, our eyes and ears on what's coming down the pike, if there's going to be any different legislation that gives us a little bit of an edge. Right now, we're just really happy that we're keeping at least the capital assistance. Is it possible we'll keep the operating? Boy, that would be so great. It really would. We're not counting on it, but you're right, it could change. There could be some kind of legislation that allows us to maintain it.
I think it's part of the discussion on the infrastructure at the national level. I
And
think there is.
anything you can do, Vice Mayor, to advocate on our behalf, we'd
I'm
be
on
more
a
than
conference
happy.
call once a week regarding transportation issues. In fact, I think I've got one this week that we're talking about it.
Yeah.
So I'll keep you
Well,
That
posted.
support
you
is,
Go, girl.
Boy, I'm trying.
All
that
right.
support is great. Okay.
All right. Great. Thank you. Appreciate all the great questions. This is great. So we want to talk a little bit about ride choice, which is a very different approach from circulators. This is really more of an individualized approach. It's a little bit more of a lower density approach, and it's a little bit more of a, it doesn't kind of have all of the planning and capital. What ride choice is it is basically a subsidized transportation program for qualified folks, people with disabilities and seniors. All of the communities who participate in ride choice now allows people with disabilities who are ADA certified. Some, not all, communities allow people who are seniors, whether or not they have a disability, to also participate. What ride choice does is it basically, imagine a taxi service, which in fact up until last year it was basically a taxi service that folks who are eligible could call to request a trip, take a trip, and get the trip at a lower cost. And with the public agencies, the cities where the people live paying for the cost of the service, the extra cost. The way our program works is we have a single point of contact for customers. It's a management company called a broker. We work with a company called American Logistics. Lots of names. You don't need to remember them right now unless you just really like to remember names. American Logistics is a broker. We hired them so that we could manage the customer experience. In this day and age, the transportation scene, as you all know, is changing radically with Uber and Lyft and new products coming online and going offline pretty frequently. The taxi industry as a whole has gotten much smaller, and there's been a lot of changes with those companies. So rather than kind of tossing our customers out there, we hired a broker who is responsible for establishing a customer service center where customers can call to request trips, to check on late trips or missing trips if the driver didn't show up when they thought. For managing, the broker manages the service. Customers can arrange for all that service. They can pay for the service. All of that is through the broker. So basically, the broker is kind of a one-stop shop. The broker then has subcontracts. They have a contract with Lyft, which is, of course, the popular rideshare service. They contract with several taxi cab companies, including 2 or 3 that are out here. They also contract with other providers who bring wheelchair accessible vehicles into the service. And I want to just stop on that because one of the challenges that taxi programs like Ride Choice have had for years is how do you serve people who need an accessible vehicle? Most taxi companies have very few accessible vehicles available. They cost more, and so the companies don't buy them and the drivers don't lease them. What we determined that we needed to do was to specifically have companies in the program that can serve people who can't be served by traditional taxis and Lyfts and things like that. The way the program works is the customer pays $3 to travel up to 8 miles, and they pay $2 a mile beyond that point. The reason for that is this is a non-mandated service. It is it's regulated in the sense that we have to follow the law, but there's no regulation that says you have to run it like this. So our goal with Ride Choice, and I'll talk about Mesa in a second. Our goal with Ride Choice was to encourage people who are using paratransit and costing the region about $50 a trip to try Ride Choice and cost the region about $20 a trip. And so we've tried to make the program as convenient as possible for customers. So the service is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Customers can book ahead. They don't have to. We recommend that they book ahead, especially as you get out into more suburban areas, because coverage is not as good. And particularly that's true for people that need accessible vehicles. But they can do that. They can take a trip. They don't have to share. They don't have to, wait for 30 minutes for the vehicle to show. They basically book the trip. The vehicle comes. They pay $3 to go up to 8 miles, and they can have up to 50 trips per month, depending on what they need. We give everybody 20. If customers need additional trips to get to work, school, or medical appointments, we will give them 50. And the reason we selected 50 is because if you are a person who needs to travel back and forth to work or school 5 days a week, that gives you enough trips to do it and have a couple left over to go to the store on the weekend. So this is a very rich benefit. It is designed for people. Again, the goal is to have people use it and be able to count on it and use it instead of more costly paratransit. Now, it's different use cases in different cities. For example, Mesa, we've just gone through a process in Mesa. Mesa had paratransit covering 100% of their city. Demand was growing faster than they were able to continue to cover it with the resources available. What they did is they implemented Ride Choice and pulled their paratransit back to what the federal law requires, which leaves pretty large areas of Mesa without paratransit. But now all of those customers have Ride Choice. So they were able to basically pull paratransit back with minimal impact to their residents because Ride Choice is still available. That's kind of similar. A lot of our cities have that particular use case where in the paratransit areas, it's designed to basically cut cost. In the non-paratransit served areas, it's basically available as the primary way for people to get transported. So I'm going to show you some examples, but any questions about how Ride Choice works?
Yes, Laura has one. Laura?
Yes, I was curious, do you train people to access and use Ride Choice in the same way that you help people to use public transit? Because, managing the app, how to do it.
First off, there is no app. It works really from the customer standpoint, just like paratransit. They call a call center. The call center helps them book the trip. The call center monitors the trip, and if there's a problem, the call center helps them resolve. We actually are going to launch a mobile app. It's being worked on by our contractor. They have until December to get that done, along with some other features to make the program a little bit more user friendly. Because honestly, who calls anybody now? If you don't have to, you're on your phone, right? For everything but calling. So we're trying to introduce that convenience to Ride Choice, but right now it works just like Dial-A-Ride. It's just calling a different number. What we do provide is when we do public meetings, we do go out and talk about Ride Choice along with all of our other services. We do have brochures and materials like that. Unfortunately, those are just being produced, so I didn't have them with me today. We should have those later this week because we just made a lot of changes to add new cities. But no, at this point, we're not doing an official separate training for Ride Choice.
Okay, one other question is, are you able to incorporate the service animals with Ride Choice?
Yes. Ride Choice, just like any program that any business provides, is covered by ADA. So we do have very strong non-discrimination policies and procedures that cover service animals, all of the typical non-discrimination things that you would expect and that should be involved in any program for the public.
Any other questions? Joe?
I just want to make sure I understand the mechanics. Person calls in, wants to book a trip. let's say it's within that mileage, so it's $3 for the customer, and let's say it's Lyft, for this example, and $14.14 to the city of Goodyear.
Yep.
When they call in, do the, at that point, do they collect the $3 from the customer directly?
Yep.
So
Yeah,
it's like,
great question.
it's almost like currently where you have with Lyft or whatever, where there's no dollars exchanging hands.
That's right.
And then you would be billing the city for the $14 and some odd cents. Is that how that would work?
Yeah, you've got it pretty close. The customer calls, right now, the customer puts a credit or debit card on file. They can also they can put a check routing number on file with our broker. And what that allows us to do, we don't charge, we basically do it like other services do. If you put a debit card on file with a hotel, they're going to basically pre-authorize some of that money. Well, if you put a credit card, they're going to basically check to make sure you've got that limit. What we do with our broker is we do not allow them to charge people's accounts until the day of travel. So if they call ahead and book ahead, they are not charged, but they do have to have a number on file. Again, some of our customers choose to pay. We have a couple of providers who accept cash. It is not our preferred approach, both because cash creates challenges for everybody involved, and most of these services are moving away from cash. There are systems in the country right now that don't accept cash even for paratransit. We're not quite to that point, but for Ride Choice, we do encourage people to use credit or debit or a check routing number. Once they call, the funds are put on hold. Once they travel, the funds are charged, and no funds change hands in the vehicles. We do tell customers they are permitted but not required to make a tip, but that is not something that we handle. That's on their own.
And then I would assume that you would bill the jurisdiction, in this case, the city, monthly with a detail of
Yep.
all the trips and what we owe. Okay.
Yeah. And by the way, that's another reason that we used a broker, because we really wanted Lyft to participate. Working directly with Lyft, data was going to be a problem. So by having a broker who books the trip first, they book it straight into the Lyft app. They have an API, and that's as much technical knowledge as I'm going to share tonight. But they have an API into the Lyft platform. They book the trip. It allows us to capture the data for that trip so that we're able to bill the cities. And this program does get some federal funding, so we do have some fairly steep data requirements.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sherry?
Is there a reason Uber isn't included on this? Because I was just looking at my app and it does say they do have vehicles accessible. Is there a reason why they weren't included?
I think I heard your question.
Uber. Why is
Uber, yeah.
included?
Yeah, Uber is not included because Uber is not, Uber has not wanted to participate with our broker. And I will tell you, just generally speaking, Uber is a little bit more cautious about data and about integrating with third parties. They don't like to share their API. They have a different corporate orientation. And so right now we are not able to bring Uber into the Ride Choice platform. There's nothing contractually that would preclude it. They've just not been interested in joining as a subcontractor.
Okay, I was just running some of the same examples and they were coming in lower, so I was wondering why they weren't included. So that makes sense. It's a data issue.
Yep.
Any other questions? Brandon?
So, I mean, for this ride share, they can use the 4 different ones, because the Lyft is only for if they're not gonna, they need accessible taxi cab. They need more than just a standard car.
Right.
And that's where the NEMT provider would come in, or the accessible taxi cab would come in. You'd have to have that available to them from coming from somewhere. That's true, right? So there'd be the 4 different types of vehicles that could be utilized.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, with Lyft, it's Lyft. It's basic Lyft service. Now, on these examples, you're obviously looking at those. That first one there. We wanted to give you some scenarios to show, because what happens, and the way to make this work, is we've created a program that creates an equal benefit for the customer, because again, we can't discriminate. So the customer pays $3. We hold the risk, and you as the funders hold the risk for whatever the trip costs above what the customer pays. So in the case of this first example, a Lyft trip is only $14.14. for you all, but those rates range all the way up to $35. That would be for a person who's using, who needs to have a non-emergency wheelchair accessible vehicle. So that would be like not an ambulance. This is not ambulance service. It's not stretcher service, but basically like a typical Medicaid van provider company. Those guys are charging about $35 to $40 a trip. So that's what you're seeing on that example. Taxis, as you can see, they're kind of in the middle. Accessible taxis are a little bit more, but they're not as much as the non-emergency medical. And that's because with taxis, it is, to be honest, it's pretty hit or miss, especially on weekends and at night. And what I would tell you is, the only concern that we have as we think about coming to a community like Goodyear, we're very confident in Lyft. They have great coverage out here. We've talked with them. They have given us some analytics. But when we start to talk about people who need wheelchair accessible vehicles, like any community that's out on a little bit out from the metropolitan center, those vehicles are much harder to come by as you get farther out. So one of the things we would want to do is level set with all of the customers. It's really a good idea to call ahead if you can. It's not required, but you're kind of taking a chance when you don't call ahead, because we do have to get a wheelchair accessible vehicle to you. It may have to come from farther away. Your wait times might be quite a bit longer.
Brandon?
Yeah, so I'm looking at option example 4, and it's one trip. So for the accessible taxi cab, like I said, because it's harder to come out here, it could be up to $70 as a cost to Goodyear for 31 miles. So, I know the client, the customer is not going to see that. They're going to see a standard, whichever choice they pick. But yeah, I don't know if we're going to have I'm looking ahead, the recommendation. Is there like a cap on how much, if we do go that route?
So let's just get through
Break
the
it
next
down.
couple slides and
Okay.
then we're going to toss it over for a good conversation.
Okay.
So we've got a couple more examples to go through and then we'll talk about a recommendation.
Great.
Why don't we say we're going to continue? Thank you.
So with these examples, what we're really trying to do is show you kind of how this works, because as the trip gets a little longer, so now we have a 4-mile trip, it's still only $3 for the customer, but the city's portion is a little bit higher. Lyft is now $15.60, and those rates now go on up to $37.50. So they get, $37.25. So they get a little bit more. The next example here is a 9-mile example. So this is kind of where the customer fare is now starting to be impacted, because again, they can go 8 miles for $3, which is actually less than dial-a-ride. So that's actually, if you're going a short trip, it's actually cheaper. But now you're at 9 miles. And so now the trip is a little bit longer. The customer's portion is now $5 because it's $2 a mile. The provider portion has continued to go up, but it's still quite a bit less if you think about it. By the way, this Lyft price, $20.90, 75% of our trips are on Lyft. So that's the trip that is most often paid. These other amounts, these are pretty small. Taxis represent about 15% of the service. The wheelchair accessible, between accessible taxi and the non-emergency medical combined, is the other 10%. So what happens is the net rate then is what we focus on, and it's about $20 a trip. This last example, we threw this in because there are people, and we do occasionally get calls, who want to go from Goodyear to Banner Boswell. I've not been there. It must be a great place because it's a 31-mile trip to get there. If a customer goes, the thing about Ride Choice is we're not telling customers they can't take a long trip, and we do have customers who, they want to take long trips, and they understand that that's going to be, in this case, it's a $49 trip for the customer. The nice thing about it for you guys, for the city, is your exposure stays low, because once you get past that 8-mile mark, the city really doesn't incur any additional responsibility. The customer does. So this encourages people to shop local if they can, to find services closer. And we've seen this. We've seen customers who said, I really like the doctor that I go to, and I really like the store that I shop at, and I really like the church that I go to. But but when faced with the reality that, hey, that's a more expensive trip, over time, they start to change their lifestyle. And sometimes they thank us because what they find out later is actually the store closer to home isn't so bad. And now they're not spending half the day on a vehicle. So in the long term, getting people to travel shorter trips is actually good. It's good for us. It's good for them. And these fares do definitely suggest that if you can travel local, it's cheaper. This is not a good model for people that need to take very long trips. It is a good model for people who can take shorter trips. It's also a good model for people if they need to get into the service area so they can take a paratransit trip across the region. And we do have a lot of customers who do that.
Sherry?
That was going to be my two questions. The amounts, that's one way, right? So it would be another
Yes.
$50 to get back for them to pay.
Yep.
So yeah, that could get
Yep.
pricey.
Right.
And then the other is you could take the lift to get into the service area and then hook up with the rest of the system.
Yep.
So
Yep.
our people up in Australia could take, or Canamia or something, could take the lift option to get down to our central area and then would be able to hook into the other services available.
Yeah, we're actually producing, I have my doubts, to be honest, but we are producing a brochure right now. It's in production. It's not ready yet. That's basically designed to tell people if you want to take ride choice and connect up to paratransit, here's how you should do it. I will tell you, I think it's complicated, but it is possible. We do encourage people, if they want to do that, it is an option. There are people who need to do that because they need to take trips they can't otherwise afford. I mean, we have a lot of customers who were healthy. They bought into these large planned communities in their 50s when they just moved here from wherever. And then they got older, they got sicker, and now they're stuck. And for those folks who don't have transit, it may not be the best option, but it might be the only option. And so we do try to help people understand how to do it, how to find a good place to wait where it's safe, where it's out of the heat, where maybe they can get a soda or a coffee. That soda, you just made me think about the fact that I want a soda. So, all those things we try to tell people so that they can make good decisions. But this is a retail program. It's basically like calling a Lyft or a taxi. It's not perfect. It's not paratransit, but it is a good service for most people.
Yes.
So, thank you. Thank you very much, Ron. Before I jump into the recommendation and a little bit of information I want to share about that, are there any questions, additional questions for Ron? Or shall we just jump right in and then we can have some conversation about this?
Any additional questions? Brandon, you have your hand up.
So, once you set up a route, you said it's really hard to stop it if the ridership goes down. Is there a threshold where they see over a certain amount of time, people stop riding it for whatever reason, or people move away, or
Okay.
something happens? Is there a threshold for that?
So what you're talking about is a bus route, right?
Yeah.
Okay. There are now performance standards being put in place. Valley Metro has spent the last year or so running different performance standards in front of all the cities, all the representatives like myself that go to these meetings. They run what they believe are the best standards to operate transit service. And they're the ones that provide all that ridership statistical information back to us. And that it's a joint conversation. If there is poor, under the performance standards that they provide, poor ridership occurring on a route, first of all, the cities are going to be pretty inclined to go ahead and pull back, terminate, or even change the route. And that happens a lot too, where there's an adjustment made. There's actually something coming up too with Zoom where we're going to be making an adjustment. It's not on this show. Where once you see that whether the route is performing up to what is expected for the standard, you can continue. But if for something changes in that area, some service shuts down, or anything can happen that can change the ridership, then adjustments are made. There's a public process for that, where you have to post that you're going to be either changing the route or eliminating the route, and that gives the public an opportunity to weigh in on that, and Valley Metro works with those folks to try to find alternative solutions. Now, ride choice is completely different. Ride choice would be citywide. This is an alternative to fixed route service and ADA dial ride. Okay. Go ahead, Rebecca.
All right, well, thank you. So I would like to, again, first of all, thank Ron for coming out and walking us through this complex conversation. I've certainly learned a lot myself as I've gone through this, and I hope you did as well this evening. So based on this information that we've presented this evening, the idea of a circulator at this point in time for the city of Goodyear is not one that we, based on what we've learned and the experience and looking at the other municipalities, Zoom is doing great for us today, the piece of it that extends into Goodyear from the Avondale area. It does have good ridership, and we're happy with that. We are, however, interested in having a transit study done with the city of Avondale to look at future opportunities. We are looking at proposing to have that kicked off in January of 2020. And it would be, the study itself would have some federal funding. And then we would also, the city's participation would be $25,000 that would come out of, I believe it's the Marquee.
Or the lottery funds.
Okay, so there's a couple of the places related to transit where that money, our participation in that study would come from. That way we could really get a feel for where are the needs. Now, also associated with that, we are recommending that we do a pilot program for a 2-year ride choice. And the reason we're looking at this now is because our sister cities of Avondale and Tolleson are actually kicking off their ride choice this July. So, and then to the north of us, we have Surprise, which also participates in ride choice. And so we've been working with those cities to look at what are their costs, what are they anticipating, because we do not know what interest we will have. And I can't remember who asked that question. What is the interest beyond what we know today? We're not sure what that is. So the reason we're recommending a cap of $200,000 is just because we think that's a good number. We think that is very realistic. We think we can make it through the year with that based on what we know today. Also based on the amount of funding that Avondale's putting towards theirs. We've looked at Surprise and Surprise's numbers. They've actually had theirs ongoing for 7 months now. So we came up with a number that we believe will be adequate for the city of Goodyear. But again, we do not know who will utilize this. We're hopeful that it will be taken advantage of by a lot of our citizens. But again, without knowing, we don't want to not put a cap and then not really understand what that is. We can, but again, Christine, did you want to add anything?
I was going to let Ron talk about that because when Ron and I talked about a pilot program, it's a little unusual in transit to do that because you never want to put something out there that you can't pull back. But Ron came up with some pretty good, there's going to be a lot of assessment going on during this pilot. You want to talk about that a little bit?
I'm trying to remember all the wise things I must have said. they're eluding me right now, but
The number of people.
yeah, what we're thinking about is 50 people. We know from the across the region some basics from other cities and other customers' behavior. We know that typically, if we sign up 50 people for a ride choice, approximately 20 of them are going to use the service during any given month. They're going to take about an average of 8 to 10 trips per month, and they're going to, use those services for primarily medical and work and a little bit of social stuff. So those are the things we know, but they vary by community to some degree. The more transit and paratransit coverage there is, the little bit lower those numbers go. and the less transit coverage there is a little bit higher. So Surprise has a little bit higher utilization. A city like, say, Tempe, they actually use a lot, but they also have a younger population, healthier population. We have some students. We have some. It's a little bit more of a different mix. So my expectation in Goodyear is that we will see the service start slowly. Because it's brand new, it's not here yet. It's also not in Avondale or Tolleson yet. What we would look to do is start with the expectation that we know we can support 50 people in the program with the funding that Rebecca mentioned. What we don't know from there is, can we add or not add? And this is a good reason to do a pilot. Because what we don't want to do is start bringing people into the program, because once they're in, they can take somewhere between 20 and 50 trips a month, and they might or might not, and we don't know what that looks like yet. The other thing we don't know here is what percentage of those trips are going to be taken by people who need an accessible vehicle. And that is the two biggest things that determine the cost of this service are the number of people who take trips, the number of trips that get taken, and the percentage of those trips that get taken on wheelchair accessible vehicles. So we really want to start kind of conservatively with no more than 50, and I think it'll actually take us a couple of months to get to that number, and that's even with outreach. And then as we start to see what the use looks like, we can bring more people in, or we can hold it at 50 and make a decision. The nice thing about a pilot, too, is we can see where are people traveling, what kind of trips are they taking, what experience are they having, what does the wheelchair service look like? Because, as I said, this is a fairly distant from where most of the wheelchair vehicle providers have their bases. So I want to make sure before we really make this like ongoing service that we are confident that we can deliver it in a way that doesn't embarrass us or put your customers and your residents in a situation where they're not getting the kind of service that they deserve.
And just a reminder, passengers would have to be ADA certified.
Yep, right.
So we don't know today how many residents in Goodyear are ADA certified. That's also a little bit of a limitation, but as Ron described earlier, you call, you make an appointment, they pick you up, they take you down there, and they run through the assessment with you. And that's how you get to that first step to be able to use Ride Choice.
Did you have a question, Brandon?
So I just want to clarify. So for the Ride Choice, which is your recommendation, the only way you can ride on that is if you're ADA certified.
Correct.
It's not for seniors or anybody else who might.
I brought up a similar question. A lot of seniors will qualify for ADA certification, just on the basis of whatever that's been Ron's experience. That was one of my questions as well.
Let me just add one other thing. One of the things in our eligibility contractor's contract is that we will do a limited number of remote certification kind of outreach meetings. And this is new. We've not done this in this region, but what we want to try to get to is to essentially bring our mobility contractor on a road show to some of the communities that are further out. This is not a great way to serve lots and lots of people, but there are folks who are very frail, who are very elderly, who probably the longest trip they would ever take from home is around the corner to, maybe just go shopping or get a hairdo or whatever. And those people are not, we do hear from customers that they're not comfortable making a trip that takes an hour to get to Phoenix and an hour to get back and spending 2 hours there. So, we're going to encourage people to come to us, but we recognize that for some, we will have remote opportunities in the West Valley for them to come to us at a much closer place. So that is something we're working on. And I can certainly see the value if we do put a pilot here of maybe, trying to figure out how to get our assessment contractor out here for at least a day, maybe if you've got a senior center that is appropriate for them to be hosted, that might be something we could work out. It's not something we can do often, because it's a pretty big staff commitment, but it is something that we expected to do about quarterly anyway.
Thank you. One more question.
Just, one more
Right.
question. So with the funding source, so you're saying the marquee, there's 1.1 roughly million there. We want to take 200 a year from there. How much that goes into that every year, roughly from is it from ad revenue and things like that?
That's a
I know
great
it's-
question. I'm not really sure what the monthly revenue is, and I'm going to bring that back for you. As a matter of fact, I can put that in the city manager's weekly. I just started working on that today. I know that it's going to, the amount that the Clear Channel pays, actually, according to the contract, it's going to go up about 3% in October, but it's like monthly advertising revenue. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact amount, but I can provide that for you.
And that can only be used for this type of use or
The
highway use?
digital marquee at the Park and Ride is on FTA land. So we are restricted. We can only use the funding for that digital marquee for transit services.
For
And
transit?
that's why it's been sitting there. There's no deadline on it. There's no reason we have to spend it right away. So we've been letting it accrue because we knew we were going to grow. We knew we were going to have needs beyond when we originally had them. And,
This just in?
oh, thank you. The digital marquee, the monthly revenue is $8,375 per month.
8,000?
8,375 per month, and that will go up in October about 3%
Oh.
per month. So we've just been letting that grow. And then the ALF money, that balance is going to change because I'm bringing the IGA for transit service for fiscal year 20 to you next Monday. But we're looking at, after we cover the expenses for fiscal year 20, you're looking at about $400,000 left over. That we do have a commitment. We have to use funds within a 2-year cycle. We had a surplus that had built up. So I've been working really hard and doing a great job spending that money, trying to fix up the Park and Ride. We've added service Sundays and holidays on the Zoom. Now we're at a point where we're kind of holding steady. And if Dial-A-Ride can just not get any more expensive, hopefully we can peel some Dial-A-Ride customers off Dial-A-Ride onto Ride Choice and reduce that expense as well. So there's a benefit there as well.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
I want to thank you for a really good presentation. When I was starting to look at this, I was like really excited, and then I was like, oh, it doesn't fit us. And then I continued through the presentation. I was like, well, I think I know where they're going with this. Because this comes back down to what our citizens, we always tell them, density, density, density. That's why we don't have the transportation route. So I think this is a great idea. My only other question, not really question, but comment would be for the transit study with Avondale. When we look at that, can we look at what it would cost to add our rec center and our city square project in? 'Cause I
So
think those-
glad you asked that question. Thank you.
Is that okay? Is that
I'm so
another
excited
slide
about.
next tomorrow?
Okay, I was really worried about adding the study because I've heard it said that sometimes studies sit on shelves and collect dust, and this did not happen with our last study. Our last study, we implemented everything in our phase 1 recommendations. We're now at this phase 2 part where we've tried Zoom, we've expanded the service a little bit, we've tested everything out. This is such an important time for us to engage in a study, and doing it with Avondale is real important too, because they're kind of in the same boat. We've partnered for years with Avondale because our borders are right on top of each other. We have so many things happening on Estrella Parkway in the next 2 years, as you all know, and they're so exciting, and people are going to want to go there. We have never studied Estrella Mountain Ranch for transit because we've had this community so far away and nothing in between the central city, and you pay for those miles where you're not picking up fares. And that's why it's always been, don't go there. You're going to be paying for non-revenue service. People will not be boarding in the middle, and that was why we always stayed away from it. Now we've got more growth, major growth going on in Estrella Mountain Ranch, so many activity centers coming on Estrella Parkway. We have our civic center coming online. There's so many reasons to take another look at this. I'm really excited about this study. And the fact that we are getting a $250,000 study for only $25,000, that's, as Councilmember Stipp might have shared with me recently, a screaming deal.
Good deal.
Wally?
So
Okay, so you're proposing to us a 2-year ride pilot
Right choice. pilot.
and a study, 2 separate things. One 20,000, one 200,000.
Yeah.
Okay. My thought is, I'm not sure we have ever really surveyed all of our Goodyear residents on what the transit needs really are. I'm not sure that we even know what's out there because we've not ever done it. And if we do a visual ADA meeting, I would like to have it only in Goodyear for us. The only senior center we have, sir, is in Avondale, and it's tiny, and very few of our residents actually go there. But I just think it would be helpful because the people we would be having you certify are people who can't get around. So they're going to have to worry about how they can get to wherever we're going to have the meeting, whether we have it up in Estrella or down here, to get them actually there. We may have to have 2, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, just to get,
Thank you, Vice Mayor.
population.
Yeah, excellent comments.
Yeah.
We would have a very robust public participation element in that study.
Good.
It's really important at this point. The only challenge you always have with a public participation process is, and we've experienced this with the budget, we put the information out there, we notify, and then we only have some.
I think this is going to be different, Christine, because we've got people coming to council meetings saying, my mother's up in Estrella, she has macular degeneration, she cannot, oh, you're here, God love you. Okay, so we've got to try to answer that. And I do understand that, but I also drive Meals on Wheels twice a month in this city, and I am amazed at where I'm going and the communities on which I'm serving a meal to that actually do need this rides desperately. People that have dialysis problems, people that have doctors. I mean, they're not just going shopping. Truthfully, they are not, because they can call Walmart, they can call Safeway, they can call Fry's, give them the order, and they'll deliver to them to their home. But they need to do specific necessity appointments, and they have no way to get there because if their children live close by, they can't get off work to take mom to the doctor 3 days a week or to get an x-ray or whatever. So, I mean, if we're really going to do it, let's really look at that population because that's who we really, really need to serve.
I couldn't agree more, Vice
Truthfully.
Mayor. Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Joe?
I like the strategy. I remember a while back where there was a state program where they tried to put some credits in, but they didn't put a cap, and next thing you know, they almost went bankrupt. So I like the strategy because you really don't know what's out there. So I appreciate the 2-year with the 200,000 cap. And if for some reason it happens to be greater, it can always come back to the council to address that issue and actually doing the study. So I think the strategy is sound and a smart one to go about. So I'm with you on it.
Thank you, Councilmember Pizzillo. Just so you know, too, there's sort of a back strategy on top of the strategy. Prop 400 extension planning is starting in September of 2020. We're talking about a 2-year pilot. That's going to bridge us to the point where we will know a lot more about what Prop 400 extension looks like. And as Ron mentioned, so many cities are moving to ride choice now. We're all going to be looking at that tax base as a funding source for all of our transit services. And that study is going to help us determine where we should put our bucks. So we've really finagled this timeline to the point where you're going to have so many available options to consider, and we can continue to make the smart decisions that you all have made over the last 10 years.
Any other questions? Ron, you did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Christina and Rebecca, we really appreciate it. We knew this was coming, I think, from the time 2005, that this was going to come to the surface. And we've just sort of been holding off, and depending on definitely the other cities. And it's a time that we shake hands and get involved in this and make it work.
And I want to thank Mr. Strasser here
Yes.
making the trip down. His mother-in-law could not be with us tonight, but he's going to be going to see her soon. And I promised him I'd give him robust notes because I'm sure he's going to get the 3rd degree about what he found out. And it sounds like we might be able to bring her some good news. So,
And we look forward to the next step. So I guess that's going to be really soon. So thank you again.
Thank you.
I need a break. So even though we planned this as a no-break meeting, we are going to take 10 minutes, all right? I have to go to the bathroom.